Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel Odontology, the study of teeth. Today we are going to see about the mechanism or the physiology of tooth eruption. Okay, when you see the actual meaning of or a simple explanation about tooth eruption is nothing but cutting of the tooth through the gums. Okay, and it has to come into occlusal pain. Okay, generally understood the exact meaning of the tooth eruption is axial or occlusal movement of the tooth from its developmental position within the jaws to the functional position in the occlusion plane. So it has to undergo a complex movements related to maintaining its position in the growing jaws and compensation for a masticatory wear. Okay. First, for the tooth movement, the most important thing is the growth of the jaws. Okay, to accommodate the size of the tooth. Okay, as well as finally, once it is erupted and comes into the occlusal plane, it should maintain into its functional position and compensation for the masticatory wear. Okay, so when you see the physiology of tooth movement or the pattern of tooth movement, there are three main stages: pre-eruptive tooth movement, eruptive tooth movement, and post-eruptive tooth movement. When a question is asked about tooth eruption, means first you write the definition what there in your textbook. Okay. Next thing what we are going to has to write is the pattern of tooth movement or the physiology of tooth movement. That includes three stages: pre-eruptive, eruptive, and post-eruptive. Pre-eruptive in short is nothing but it's the movement within the jaws before they erupt in the oral cavity. A slight movement that happens in mesial and distal. Okay, that is by taking place by resorption on the mesial side and deposition of bone on the distal side. Okay, then before it comes in or erupt into the jaws, the jaw has to or the jaw bone has to grow to accommodate the eruption of the tooth. Okay. Next stage is eruptive tooth movement is nothing but the movement of the tooth from the jaws into the occlusal or functional position, that is mesially and laterally. Okay, usually the permanent will be erupted predecessor to the deciduous tooth lingually. However, in maxillary molar, okay, there is no predecessor of the deciduous dentition. For that, in order to accommodate the eruption and functional position, the maxillary bone has to grow. Okay, especially when you see the dry skull on the maxillary region, there will be a following eruption of the maxillary molar. However, in order to grow and it comes into functional position, the maxillary bone has to grow. Okay, once the maxillary bone has been grown, it takes a sliding position coming into its occlusion. Now we move on to the each pattern of tooth movement. That is, first is pre-eruptive tooth movement. Okay, first we see about the pre-eruptive tooth movement. What I told in the introduction part, that is the movements that happens within the bony crypt of the mandible before it comes to its position of eruption. Okay, as well as the growth of the mandible has to grow. Okay, the main thing what we are concentrating is the growth of the jaw bones. Okay, the both maxillary and the mandibular bone has to grow in order to accommodate the newly erupting tooth. Okay, so when you see the first is the eruption takes place for deciduous dentition. Later, it is succeeded by permanent dentition. It will be it's a very basic one. Everyone has to do. Okay, first dentition is deciduous dentition, followed by the successor is permanent dentition. Okay, when you see the deciduous tooth germination or the differentiation, there will be a good space or available in the mandible. Okay. However, once it started erupting, there will be a mild crowding will be happening in the incisor and canine region. This later will be alleviated, okay, or relieved by the growth of the mandible. Okay, so that means the growth of the mandible or the jaw bones is must for the accommodating the eruption of the tooth. What I told is while moving or the movement of the tooth is either by taking place by resorption, okay, resorption on the mesial side and deposition of bone, okay, resorption of bone on the mesial side and deposition of bone on the distal side. As well as the function of the periodontal ligament fibers helps in movement of the tooth in its functional or occlusal plane. So next heading is eruptive tooth movement. It's nothing but tooth moves from its position within the jaws to its functional position in the occlusal, where the principal movement is the direction of occlusal or axial movement. Okay, it's nothing but tooth eruption. The direction of tooth eruption will be eruption from the jaw bones into its occlusal or functional position, where the direction is occlusal and axial. Okay, so this is the short description about eruptive tooth movement. This is the main thing to be addressed in the pattern of tooth movement. Will be dealt in detail in mechanism of tooth movement. Okay, third one is, I'm just briefing out this. I didn't go in detail. I'm just giving an introduction to pattern of tooth movement or the physiology of tooth movement. And finally it is post eruptive tooth movement. So in post eruptive, once the tooth erupts into its functional position, okay, it has to accommodate the growth of the jaw bones, okay, where it gets fixed within its position. However, a slight movements will always take place, okay, to accommodate your occlusal wear, okay, that is occlusal and proximal wear. Accommodation in here, it is accommodation to the final bone growth, that is your maxilla and the mandible jaw, the bones, and accommodation to the, or the compensation to the occlusal and proximal wear. Okay, that is by axial and mesial direction or migration. Axial and mesial migration of tooth, okay, to accommodate the occlusal and proximal wear. So what we saw in the tooth eruption is nothing but erupting of the newly formed tooth into its functional position, and where the growth of the jaw bones has to take place in order to accommodate the position of the erupted tooth or the erupting tooth. Okay, so in that you have three patterns, physiological patterns of tooth movement, that is pre-eruptive, eruptive and post-eruptive. In pre-eruptive, minor movements will happen with the bony crypt of the jaw bones, and initially when the deciduous erupts in the tooth oral cavity, there will be slight mild crowding in the incisor and canine region. Later it is relieved by the growth of the jaw bones. Okay, and there will be a movement by mesial resorption side, resorption on the mesial side and deposition on the distal side, as well as the role of pedial fibers. This is also, it is essential for the growth of the movement of the tooth will be dealt in detail in later stages. Okay, next will be your eruptive tooth movement, where the direction of tooth eruption is occlusal and axial, and finally the post-eruptive tooth movement is accommodation to the final or the cessation of the tooth within the final bone growth, and accommodation to the occlusal and proximal by axial and mesial direction. Okay, with this I complete the introduction portion to tooth eruption. The main content or the literature what I have used as a reference is the Orban's textbook of oral histology and embryology, 12th edition. Okay, very nicely it is given in Orban's textbook. So I consider all you have to read the Orban's textbook in detail to learn about the tooth eruption. In further videos, I'll be covering your histology of tooth eruption. What are the histological changes that happens in tooth eruption while tooth eruption, and next will be covered by the theories of or the mechanism of tooth eruption. That is more important. Essay question or short note. Tooth eruption itself, generally an essay question or a short note will be asked. Okay. With this, I conclude the video. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. Press the like button. Thank you.